Hey everyone, we will continue to look into material workflows by covering how to texture a tire, understanding the car paint material, and a bonus section on how to integrate your 3D models into a backplate. You will be able to bring everything together and create a realistic looking render that integrates your 3D model into a final render using image-based sliding with an HDR and a shadow matte workflow. I have everything timestamped below, so feel free to jump to whichever section you need. I will be using Maya 2020.4 and Arnold to Maya 5 for this tutorial, but know that these workflows can transfer to any software as well as any render engine. So let's get right into it. So here we are in Maya, and this is pretty close to where we last left off. I covered how to do plastics, coated metals, lights, with transmission, chrome, and a lot of various other materials. In this video, I will be covering the car paint and the rubber tire. Now, I do recommend that you take a look at my previous tutorial where I really get into the fundamentals of materials. So this will help you give you a good understanding as to what makes up a PBR material in really any render engine. Also, if you're interested to grab this model, you can grab that from my ArtStation store here, and you can pretty much always find it on sale here. Getting this will help support the channel and the content that I make. So now that we're inside of Maya, and I can select my tire. So I'll begin with the tire texture first. I will select both of these objects here and assign a new material, or go to favorite material, and you can do standard surface. So this is the standard Arnold AI standard material. And the thing to understand here, even before we get into the materials, is the UVs. And you can see that I actually have this separated as two objects. The sidewall is one object, and then the tread is another. And both of them are neatly unwrapped. So now that I understand that, I can start the material process. So if I jump over to my render settings here, and you can see that I'm just using HD 720. I'm using actually just Arnold GPU here, with 8 camera AAs. And if you're using CPU, you can use pretty much close to these settings here. And you can lower the camera AA. It doesn't need to be nearly as high. And this should give you enough samples to create a good looking render. But for now, I'll stick to GPU since I have a good RTX 3090 that's going to, pretty much tear through these renders. So I'll set up my camera here and then just kick on IPR by hitting Start IPR. So now we can see we have the standard material here, and then I have the material right in the hypershade. So I'll call this, AI tire, and I have an iteration of this. So I'll just call this tire demo. And from here, now I can select this material and start working my way through. And I'm going to quickly go through the settings here, because we've covered these in detail in the last video. So I will set the weight to 1, so we have full color weight here. And the key thing to understand is always use reference, right? You can see that I have this massive mood board here that just has reference and just really every angle imaginable of this car, and a couple different models and trims and variations of this vehicle. So this is the Datsun 240Z by Sung Kang, and I'm going to use this as the overall material reference for creating this. So you can see how shiny the material is for this rubber tire, and we're going to use this as our basis. So with this in mind, I can select the material, and I can now set this to a little bit darker. Right? So I'm going to have this be actually pretty dark here. And we're going to keep our reference up. If you're using pure ref, you can hit Control-Shift-A, and that'll make sure that it always stays up docked. And whenever you don't need it, just hit Control-Shift-A again, and then it'll go away. So I can Alt-Tab, bring that back, Control-Shift-A, and there we go. So I'm going to bring this really pretty dark here, get pretty close to what we're seeing. And I'm using kind of a similar light setup, so we should be pretty close in value and whatnot. Now that I have this set up for the color, I'm actually going to increase the diffuse roughness, because rubber among, compared to a lot of other objects, is pretty rough. So this is one of the few times where I'll actually use diffuse roughness. This is not specular roughness, this is diffuse roughness. So as I increase that, you'll see it'll make the actual surface more kind of based off that microfacet surface that we talked about in the previous tutorial. It'll just make that a bit rougher. So something around here should give me what I need. Because this is a non-metal object, we can leave metallic at 0. Now we're going to look into specular. I typically like to set my specular weight all the way to 1. Then I increase and decrease my roughness as needed. So this is using a default value roughness of 0.4. And from here, I can start to bring this down a little bit, start to bring this up. But for what I'm trying to achieve here, I'm going to actually be using a texture map. I will be using a procedural noise actually. All right. I will begin the material process by first breaking up the roughness, the specular roughness. So within my hypershade graph here, I'll hit tab and I'll type in AI noise. So noise is just a great procedural node that will help just break up these nice smooth reflections. As you can see, everything is too perfect and pristine. And if we look at our reference, you can just see how much variation there is. There's all this subtle variation, not to mention in a lot of, the reference and the vehicle. I mean, this thing is driving a lot. So there's a lot of dirt, dust, rocks, and pebbles. And I'll cover that in a future tutorial. But for right now, we're kind of taking it one step at a time to create, these complex materials. So with this AI noise, I can bring this node over here to the left, and I typically like to start off with, a couple of octaves. So I'll start with 2 octaves, and let's get this plugged in here into the material. Now, if I just take this right now and expand out color, and I want to plug this into the specular roughness, because this is the variation where we want this variation to happen. So I need to apply this as a R channel or a single channel, because this is not a colored value. You can see that, RGB is the color itself. And then because these are grayscale or single values, I'd have to grab one channel. So I grab channel R and bring this over to specular roughness, and then that connects there. And you can see right off the bat, what effect that we're starting to get, right? So if I select here and I select the node and then I do isolate select, we can see the noise, the procedural noise being affected and impacted on this object. And now I'd want to bring down the scale a bit, right? So maybe like 0.1, because I'm just looking for large scale specular variation here that we're seeing here. I'm not going for very fine or micro detail quite yet. So just by doing that and kind of going back on isolate select, we can see what we have. Now, I can impact and change these colors here. Black means that it's 0 roughness. White means that it's fully rough, so no shine at all. And this is the variation that we have. So I want to get somewhere kind of in between. Now, what I used in the last tutorial is using that AI range, right? So if I move this over to the left and I hit tab, I can just type in AI range. And this is going to help kind of remap these values and give me even more control. So I can connect this R channel, or actually I want to do the out color here, just so you can see that. It's out color into input. And then you can see this is not connected yet. I want to take the out color here, and this will now become my specular roughness. This is the same workflow that we used in the previous video. Now, I do know for sure that I want to bring this color down a bit so it's not full white or, completely rough here. And then now within my remap node, or I should say my AI range node, now I can start modifying these values and kind of remap it to get something that isn't as drastic and is a more subtle effect. And the values that I worked with typically for this rubber effect here is going to be somewhere around like this 0.2 range to 0.7 for my input. So I'll bring this to about 0.7-ish so we can start to see. And then I want to output these around that 0.2 to 0.4. All right. And this is going to give me this nice variation here and this nice subtle effect. Now you can mess with the smooth step if you'd like, and sometimes that gives you some nice results with how it kind of interpolates between these points. And just by doing that, you can see that we have now this nice variation in the specular highlight. It's no longer perfect. It's no longer, it's no longer perfect. So now we can start to add in more detail. So we can start to add in this sidewall texture. All right. So in order to do that, we can just create a texture node. So I'll hit tab, and we want to do that by using file. So if I grab file, then texture, I can bring this in here. Now you can find sidewall textures pretty much all over the internet. So I can do sidewall texture, and you'll find just a ton here. Even though I'm using Bing instead of Google, these are pretty much the same images. So feel free to find whatever will work for your tire. Keep in mind, they are pretty specific. For right now, I did not have the time to create a custom one for this, so I just grabbed one online, and we're going to use this for this demonstration. All right. So once I do that, I already have that downloaded and in my source images folder. So I'll open up the folder icon here, and I will find the sidewall texture. And there we go. So we'll be using this. And I like this one because it had a good amount of detail that you can see matches pretty closely with what we have here, though it's pretty far off, to be honest, but it's going to give me some good detail to use as reference. So once I have that, now I can use, I already know I want control over how intense this map is. So I will plug this into an AI range here. So I have an AI range, and I want to take the out color here and plug that into the input like so. Maybe I'll give myself a little bit more room here, and this should help. All right. So, and I have the attribute editor too. Okay. Now we are creating this as a bump texture map. So I want to grab these nodes, move these over to the left, and we're going to plug this into the normal camera. But before we do that, we have to create a AI bump. So I do AI bump 2D, and then now I can take this sidewall texture, and I want to take the out color here. And this is going to plug into the, if I hit Control A, we have our attribute editor, and maybe I'll move that. No, I can't. So I'll take this and grab out color R, and that's going to plug into our bump map. And you can see that it connects there, and it's looking pretty good. We haven't applied this to the material itself. I still have IPR going. So now, once we take this out of value now, and we plug this into normal camera, then you should start to see the texture detail coming in. Now, I don't have any denoise or anything, but you can start to see it's coming through. So now we need to work within the parameters of what we've created with the AI range and the bump map and start modifying these values. All right. So if I grab this, I know I want to increase this to a value maybe of 0.1, 0.2. So I'll set this to about 0.2, and you can already see it brings this up. Now, please know that this is scale dependent, so you may have to bring this either a lot further up by a factor of 10 or much lower, depending on the scale of your model. My vehicle was Model 2 scale, so these values work for a real world scale vehicle. All right. Now, once I have that, this is actually looking pretty good. I like the overall detail here, and I can control this if I wanted to by going to the AI range now, and I can start to bring these values down here a little bit if I wanted to get a little bit more contrast, so you can start to see that the detail is coming through. So you can do that through this AI range here. You can also do that through the strength here, or I should call it bump height. So it really it just depends where. So I typically like to at least have this AI range here, just so it allows me to, like if I bring this down to 0.5, we'll kind of see what it really does. And it really starts to increase this detail here. Now, don't worry, we're going to apply a different map for the sidewall, but for now, I want to start with the sidewall. So now what I want to do is create that high frequency detail on the noise on the tire. So in order to do that, I'll hit tab, type in AI noise, and we'll create a new node here. And this node will connect into its own bump map. So I will hit tab again and type in AI bump. So we get something like this. And just like before, I want to take this R channel here and plug this into the bump map, because we're just taking a single grayscale value here for bump. And then from this out value now, I can take this and plug this into the AI bump node with the sidewall texture. And this is going to plug in. So if you hit other, this is going to plug into normal. So you can just connect those nodes and hit normal, and you can see that it connects. And that should give us what we need here. Now, if you're having trouble with that, I know sometimes connections can be weird. You can just middle mouse, drag this on top of normal, and you can make sure to plug in the out value into normal. And that'll essentially do the same thing. And hit close, and then we have this now. So, oops, did I plug that into itself here? All right, so I just reconnected those nodes, did the same thing. So out value into normal. That was really weird. I think I misdragged something. But anyways, just middle mouse drag that, connect out value into normal, and we should be good to go. Now, if I select this noise and check isolate select, you can see what type of scale that we have here. Now, if you want to have this be more high frequency, you want to increase the scale, which will create, that high frequency and increase that tiling. So now we get this really, this subtle noise here. And depending on what you're trying to go for, you may bring this down a little bit or bring that up. If I want to bring maybe 8, a value of 8. Now, we need to be careful here, because this is going to really, have a strong impact on what we're trying to create here. And if I bring this bump height up of this high frequency detail to something like 0.1, now you can really see it kind of coming into effect, right? So this is a bit extreme. So I want to go back to this AI noise, and instead of using, black and white, I can start to use maybe black and dark gray, because this will give me something a bit more subtle and still give me that nice high frequency detail if we really start to get in close here. So you can start to see that noise, and as this starts to clear up, it's going to give me a nice, much more realistic effect here. So this is really close. You can also play with, increasing octaves and distortion and, do whatever you need. Once all this is set up, you can apply this workflow really to any type of material or any rubber tire texture. So I like how this is looking. We can kind of call this one done for right now. And what I want to do is create the sidewall or the tread variation. So what you can do is take this node and go to edit, duplicate, and then do shading network. And then you can output connections of both of these. And so now I have the tire. We'll call this sidewall demo. And then I have this one where it's going to be tread. So that'll be just the tread detail. And for this tread detail, I can actually isolate this like so. I'd say it'd probably be better to pull this out a bit just so I can see it kind of independent. So I can make sure that's really cleaned up here. And I can select the tire tread here, even though that kind of looks pretty cool. And I can select the tread, hold right click, assign material. So now this is a separate material being applied, but it's based off of the same nodes that we created. And what I want to do here is just take this sidewall AI range and delete it. And there you go. And this gives us the effect that we want. And you can see the subtle detail that's kind of happening in here with the normal map and the sidewall texture. And it's really starting to come together really nicely. So I'm happy with this. And I can put this back in its original position just by simply zeroing it out. And there we go. So this is the overall workflow that I used to create nice, simple, fairly realistic tires. Now, of course, we can take it even further by adding a lot of dust and scratches and different, tire peeling effects and stuff like that. So, like I said, we'll take that one video at a time and cover that in a future video. Now, with the tire complete, we can now turn our attention to the car paint, right? I'm sure everybody wants to take a look at how to make a good car paint. So what I will do is start by selecting all of my car paint material. So if I select all of the objects here, there we go. I want to create a new material. So if I hold right click with these objects selected, I can assign a favorite material. Actually, I need to do new material because it's an AI car paint, not the standard surface. So I do AI car, and there you go, AI car paint. Now it's going to right off the bat put this, really hot red here. So what I want to do is go to my car paint, and I'll just call this AI car paint demo. We're going to walk through these settings here, and what really helps is to take these one step at a time, because sometimes when this is your first time going through it, you may not know what is really affecting the reflection, be it coat or flakes or even, the specular or the base. So this is, a more complex version than the standard surface. So now we can take the specular, set that to 0, right? And I can start collapsing these so they don't get in the way. And, then we have kind of these sub flakes here, which are set to a density of 0, so we're not going to see that. Great. So once we have this, now we can take a look and really start to understand again what makes up these materials. All right. Now I have a couple of references here. As you can imagine, there's a base coat, a specular coat, and then there is the clear coat layer. And then you have, how the light is going to interact with all of these layers. All of these layers with the coat and the specular are going to be transparent, right? So it's going to pass through the clear coat, hence the name. And then once it reaches the base coat, this is where, depending on how rough the surface is, it'll be how rough the specular highlight is. And not only that, is you also have pigment and then flakes. And so that's where you can get really, really different effects and different results. Sometimes, so I just kind of have, pulled this from online that just shows a bunch of a variety of different types of paints. So, I've been working in the automotive industry for over a decade now, and this is a big thing. There is so much, design and engineering that goes into just creating a good paint, right? So you can see how just by altering any one of those bases, any one of those layers, gives you a completely different looking effect, right? You get a more metallic material or a metallic paint sometimes, depending on how many flakes you have or how specular and rough that base coat is. Now, sometimes you get that candy coat where, the base is not very reflective or very metallic, or doesn't even have a lot of flakes, and then you just kind of have this base and clear coat, right? And you see those in a lot of old school vehicles, which is actually what this Datsun's based off of. So again, depending on how many flakes are on there, or the intensity and density and scale, right? Because you can see between these two variations, right, is significantly different, right, as far as the density and scales of these flakes. And when you really stand back and look at a car, it has an overall impact on just how the car interacts with the lighting. And here's just kind of a good example, again, of just kind of, the thickness of clear coat. And then sometimes you get like double and triple and quad, like multiple layers of clear coat even, right? And so it can be very, very intricate in how it can be put together. Now, for what we're going to be doing this, where with a clear coat and then your base coat, and then essentially in between these, this is where we're going to be getting the specular. So it's going to be based off of this documentation here, which is based off of Arnold's information here. I highly, highly recommend. As always, I always like to refer to documentation from these render engines. They put together this information and it is fantastic and does a really great job really breaking down what I'm about to explain in a video format. All right. So knowing that, let's now start modifying these materials. So, I have a white version of this, a white paint, which was pretty simple. This white paint is not metallic. It has a subtle amount of flakes, if any, right? I think you can get pretty close here and you really don't see a lot of these flakes here. Now, this may not exactly matter for what you're trying to create, but I just want to make sure that you understand that reference is key here. Understanding how paint is made and engineered, is going to help you create a much more accurate car paint material. All right, great. So now that we know this, I'm going to jump down to something a little bit more, a bit more intricate, and I can maybe even put my own spin on this, but I want to work with this orange material here. All right, based off of this kind of original version of the Datsun 240Z. So with this, I can start with this orange base. Now, just be careful, right? Like sometimes there's some post work or even some different variations. These are actually two clearly different cars because you can tell by the rims here, right? But I think I just put them together because they were pretty close. But knowing this, I'm going to grab this orange. It's going to be this hot orange with a hint of red, right? So that's what I'm going to be using as my reference. So I bring this and hit Control-Shift-A there. Now that'll stay. And what I can do is take my color and do an eyedropper. Now this isn't going to work perfectly, but it's going to give me a good start and a good base. So there we go. So this gives me the kind of this nice orange, and then I'll find this hero angle that'll work well for what I'm trying to create here. So maybe something like this, right? So we can see the variation that's happening. Now, depending on, how rough this surface is. Now, as always, actually, make sure to set your weight to 1. So we have that. And then I'm going to bring down the roughness a bit here. I mean, you can maybe zero it out and see what that does. And then as you increase the roughness, it'll become a rougher surface. And now that we have that, let's take a look at our specular. So our specular now, we have this. I'm going to actually zoom out a bit. See if I can find... This angle should be fine. Yeah, this should be fine for what I'm trying to create. Maybe I don't like all the green in that one, so I'll stick to this reference here, which is a bit more neutral. So I have this here, and now I can bring in the specular. And if you look at the base coat here, depending on the resolution, you can get a good amount or a good understanding of how reflective this base coat is. So I'll set this weight to full-blown 1, and then now we're starting to get something and some life into our reflection. So I can leave, I'd say, the color at white, and then now I can start to increase and decrease the roughness. Now, since these are more candy coated, with these rough base coats and really shiny coats, clear coats, I'm going to increase the roughness a bit, and sometimes I'll go like, depending on really how rough that surface is, I'll go up pretty high, right? It really depends on the type of car paint, right? But as long as you understand that, you can apply that to any type of material here. So I like this. Now, what I've used in all render engines is essentially creating this camera facing kind of Fresnel effect, or this fall off. And what you can do is just use flip-flop, right? So flip-flop is nice because if we head to the documentation, what that does is it gives you, so there's light facing color, and then you have the flip-flop here. So let me find that reference here. Yeah. So what this is saying is by using flip-flop, you want to apply a gradient to it. And this can give you sometimes what's called a pearlescent effect, and will give you kind of, as you have this camera facing angle, anything facing the camera will be a specific color. And as you look away from the camera, or as the object turns away from the camera, you get a different color. And this is what this ramp is here, right? So notice how this is kind of this stock, like just full on blue. But then if I move my mouse off of this, you can see how you get the lighter version on that's closest or facing the camera, I should say. And then as it faces away from the camera, it starts to become that dark blue around this side. If I hover over, it actually changes, so I can't hover over. But yeah, if you look towards the back here in this area, you'll start to see dark blue. Front here gives you that light blue, and that's what we want to create. And you find that subtle effect in almost every single car paint. Now, you can take it even further with light facing color and create really these nice pearlescent effects, or further pearlescent, but we're going to just mess with flip-flop here. All right, so with this flip-flop here, looking at this, as you can see, as it starts to get away from the camera, these surfaces start to face away from the camera, it gets darker orange, darker red. So this is going to be a nice example where I can apply this. So if I go to flip-flop, and actually instead of just changing the color, I want to apply a ramp. So what I want to do is find the surface, output connections again, and here we go. And from here, I can now create a ramp. So I have to do AI ramp, RGB, and there you go. So now we have, this is your standard ramp, gradient ramp, right? And where I want to plug this in is into specular flip-flop. So if I middle mouse drag that, I can just plug that in. And this is an RGB value, so I don't have to worry about this because obviously we're dealing with a color here. So that's going to go into specular flip-flop. Now, if I visualize this, you can start to see what's happening, right? Now, depending on the type, you have U, as in UV coordinates, and then V, and then diagonal, and radial, and different effects. So I would definitely mess with these different effects and see which one gives you the best results. I'm going to stick with using V. Why? Because I actually set up my UVs for this vehicle. So if I select my objects here, these objects, even though they're overlapping right now, I still need to kind of pack them. I adjusted them so I get a nicer UV where that this ramp is being applied to this. So the front of the vehicle is here. The rear of the vehicle is at the top. All right. So that's what I did here. Now you may need to adjust your UVs in order to get this to work the best, or you can try to use a different type of ramp here. Now that I know that, for this specular highlight, I can change this color to be that orange-ish color. So if I go back here, I have this orange color here, and drop the value in a little bit of that saturation, and back to flip-flop, I can change this color to that orange and start to work from here. So as it gets closer, I want it to be a little bit lighter, or maybe even like brighter orange. So if I actually move this here, brighter orange, now this is applying to the specular. And then as it gets further away, I can select this node and start with this base orange and give it more of that red color. So if I start to darken it and bring these down a bit, maybe increase the saturation and get this more red here. Now, if I select this effect here with this ramp, you can start to see what this is doing, right? So you get brighter orange highlights at the front and darker towards the back. It helps sometimes to visualize this. I like to use sometimes, red and green. So if I have like orange, I do green, and it better visualizes exactly like, oh, okay, I get how this is going to work, right? So I'll undo that and really start to bring this color where now I want to bring in some more red, this darker red. So this is where I switch from HSV actually and go to RGB and start to just reduce the amount of green, which is going to increase the red, and increase the red here. And this is going to give you that nice darker one without having to be like pinpoint accurate for the color wheel. Sometimes the color wheel here, it's inaccurate, or it's not very accurate. So that's where I could do the fine tuning of these colors. And this is how I do paints, right? This is how I do paints, and regardless of whatever render engine that I'm using. So I hope this, this workflow is definitely going to help. So now that I have that color ramp, I can head back here, turn off isolate select, and we have the color here. Maybe you bring back some of that roughness. And now what I can do is bring up our coat. We've done all this work and we don't even have our coat layer. So now I can increase coat. All right. And so once we bring in coat, we get that nice layer on top. And of course, if we bring back our reference, we want to stay pretty close to our reference, and we're getting there. And what I end up doing is get as close. I get pretty close to this in my render, and then I finish it in post. If I'm working with a client or a designer where they want it to be as close as possible, you're not going to get that through these colors, but you want to get close so you can do that, the rest of it, in compositing and post-production. Now we can bring in the paint flakes. So I want to get a bit closer here. And I definitely don't want to render the transmission and refraction of the light. So I'll kind of get in a nice position where I can really see what's going on. And again, you're starting to see that effect here. You can push it further if you want, where you're getting this lighter orange here and then darker as you get further down the vehicle. So the flip-flop's working really nicely. And if I bring back my pure ref, even though it's not part of the reference, I'll at least show you the paint flakes. So now that I've got this, I can expand paint flakes and we can increase the density, right? So this is pretty sensitive depending, again, on your scale. So if I increase the density here, now let's see what's going to happen. There we go. This is going to give it that really metallic look, all right? So again, kind of coming back to this chart here, depending on how many flakes that you have or the density and the scale, it's really going to give you a much more metallic look, right? So versus this orange you typically find in more this pearl look, where it's kind of this clean base coat with layered clear coats, versus something that's more metallic, like this blue wave metallic, where you have a lot of flakes. But we're just experimenting here, and from here, actually, maybe I'll move to get a larger view here and just double check. I actually want to turn off my denoiser because what's happening here is the denoiser is just killing my paint flake detail. All right, so I'll turn that off here, and then I'll zoom back in, because I was like, man, I'm not seeing it, and it was probably doing that to the tire, but this will work well here. So now we're starting to get that nice detail here. If I go to this paint flake, I have this, and you can start to change the color, and depending on the color and the density, right? Like I have this base orange, and if I want it to be like this base orange with this hot red, this metallic red, then I can bring back those reds here, and it's going to give you that nice looking, effect here. That's going to be pretty close to at least kind of this base coat here. If you went in kind of an opposite direction and almost made it like yellow, you'll start to see how that starts to affect the color. Let me give us more real estate here, right? So this is kind of a green yellow, but I'll get rid of some of that green and actually switch back to HSV. So we get something like that. All right. So just by adding these flakes here, it gives you, a whole nother set of properties to really change the overall look and effect of your material, right? And I have these all set up, and things are looking good. And I can change this, like, just to get pretty experimental. Like, you can change these to like blue and kind of see what that's going to have, what impact that's going to have, and you get some pretty interesting results. And again, depending on the density here, if you really start to increase the density, it can almost essentially overtake the entire color. Like if I really crank this up, like it's going to be, you get this super metallic look here, which is definitely pretty interesting. You don't find that often, but that's how you kind of get this nice, almost like sparkly look to your car. So we'll definitely turn this down, back to the 0.01 effects. And what's cool too is you can apply that flip-flop here to the flakes itself, right? So I can take this ramp here, and if I wanted to, I just control D duplicate. We can start with this, and I can middle mouse drag that flip-flop, that gradient ramp on this flip-flop here, and then we can start to get, more extreme versions of this where I can make these a lot more saturated if I bring in these colors here, more red, more orange. And then same thing with this one, more orange for sure, more red, less green, less blue. All right, and so that'll give you kind of this nice effect to really kind of control the overall look. So it depends really if you're using more of this pearl candy coat is what I like to call it, or if you're doing more of this metallic coat. And then of course you can use light facing to get more of that, pearlescent look where it's kind of changing. So, but this about covers all I wanted to go over on the car paint for now. And, I come from more of the marketing and advertising background. So, everything has to be perfect, right? Now I've worked on some games and some movies before too, and in that instance, you really want to beat up these reflections, and so that's where I'll show you how to take, how to go from a perfect clean looking render to a it just spent 2 hours or 3 hours or a day at the racetrack. Let's really dirty this up. Let's add some dust. Let's add some grime. If you're interested in kind of how to get imperfect reflections, actually, because if you look at my vehicle right now, if I check these body lines, and I'm going to actually remove these paint flakes. So if I actually set the density to 0, we have something like that. I can get in pretty close here, and I spent a lot of time modeling this vehicle to maintain these nice beautiful reflections over these panels, right? So they're nice and clean, and this is even done in photography where they'll take a picture of a vehicle and they will even Photoshop the body lines to make sure that it looks perfect, because they're trying to sell an idealized version of this vehicle or product. If you want to bang this up a bit, you would start to apply some coat normals, and you can even apply some noise to the specular roughness, just like we did to the tires. I will for sure reference Arvid here, and he covers this in good detail as well. I was looking at some good references on how to get imperfect reflections, and his tutorial popped up, and he uses this multi-layered effect to achieve that. So definitely take a look at this if you are interested in how to do that. But for the sake of time, I want to move on to the final topic, which is how to take this and integrate it into a backplate. Okay, now that we have the materials set up, we can now look into creating that backplate and creating this render with that backplate. So the first thing that you need to do is find your image-based lighting and backplate that you want to use. As usual, you can head over and find a ton of free HDRIs and backplates right from here on Polyhaven, and you can find a nice HDR. I ended up using this one. I like this one. Had interesting background elements. It has a nice sky with cloudy sun here. And the main thing is, if you actually hit this menu here, is then it has backplates, and you can find any one of these backplates. I believe I ended up using this one here, so you can simply download both. I would download the pretty JPEG and the original RAW. Why do you want to download the original RAW? Is because we need camera information. All right, so download these. I'm gonna, I've already downloaded these. I just went and did the HDRI, and I ended up using this image here as both the pretty JPEG and the original RAW. So once I have that, I can get rid of this material editor, since I'm essentially done with the materials, and I just kind of went back and forth looking at the white and the orange here. So I can kind of maximize this viewport pane and maybe give myself a bit more real estate here. And I want to create a new camera. So I will go to panels and do perspective, new. Now this is going to be called, I'll just call this camera match. underscore demo. And from here, now I can start bringing in those backplates and those HDRIs. Now for this backplate, I'm not going to be using this backdrop here. So I'm going to hit Control H to hide this. Then I don't want to outright delete these lights, but I will Control G to group these and call it, light group. And I'll hit Control H to hide, and we've hidden that. Then I have just my dome light here. Now this dome light is what I'll be using for this image-based lighting, and I also need a ground plane. So I'll hold Shift and right click and create a plane and hit scale and just kind of bring this up here. Oops. And just scale that up. So something like this, because all we're using this is to capture the background. Or excuse me, the ground shadow on our background. All right, now I won't be using the Studio HDRI. Like I said, I'll be using kind of that tank farm from Polyhaven. So what I want to do is just swap this out. So if I hit this black arrow, the output connections, I want to hit the folder and I want to find my tank farm HDR. Here it is. So you want to grab the HDRI and hit open. And that'll swap out, and the first time we render it, it'll be a bit slow here. It says it has to generate the .tx file. Okay, now that we have the image-based lighting set up, I will see if I can find my camera match here. So if I find my camera match demo, and I'll go ahead and render this. And I need to make sure that it finds the camera match demo. There it is. Okay, so we have this now set up with my right camera. Good. So we're all good there. And what I want to do now is I'm only using this dome light for lighting, right? Because what I'm trying to achieve is placing this on the background. For example, I have this here that I kind of ran through, and you can see what I have with the vehicle separate of the shadow, which is also separate of the background. And that allows me to layer everything together and do what I need to do. I think I accidentally moved the camera on that bottom one, and then bring in some AO and whatnot. Really helps ground it, right? So that's what we're about to create right now. So, because I've seen some videos, I was taking a look at kind of what's out there and what are people doing, and everybody just seems to just do it with projecting the shadow on the HDRI, which isn't that bad. So for example, I'm just going to take this ground here and apply the shadow matte material that I'm talking about. So if I hold right click, assign new material, go to Arnold, and I'm just going to type in shadow, and we get AI shadow matte, and that's the shadow matte that you want to apply. And just by simply doing this and do a quick IPR, you get something that looks somewhat decent, right? So let this think here real quick. All right, so it just took it a second to think and generate that TX file, but this is what you get. Again, this doesn't look that bad, and you may get something that looks pretty good, but what I'm trying to do is actually really make it look like it was part of the scene by using a already created backplate, because you almost never would do this in real shots. You're always going to have a backplate to work from. All right, so it's nice to do some look dev in, but it's not a final result. So let's walk through this process. So once I have this set up here, now I need to bring in my backplate. So if I go to view, image plane, import image. Now you need to do this on whatever camera that you're trying to match. So I have my camera match demo, and then I'm going to find image plane, import image right here in my view. We're going to find my backplate. Here it is, the pretty version. And we're going to bring that in. And that's going to project it right over my vehicle. No big deal, because the first thing that I want to do is increase the depth. So if I set this to about 1,000, now I can see it over the HDRI and then over my vehicle. All right. Now, if you notice that you need to scale this up to get this out of the way. When I say this, I mean the dome light. You can select your dome light, kind of scale that up just so it's not right on top. So I might do that by another factor, maybe factor of 10, something like that. All right, now that I got that, the key thing, this is why we downloaded the raw image. If I go to the folder here, I have the raw NEF. If I right click this and do properties, then I have details. And then here's the most important information when camera matching is your focal length. I now want to set my focal length to 17 millimeters because that's what this camera was shot in. So I want to select my camera match demo and set the focal length here from 17 to, 35 to 17. There we go. Now this is skewed. This is going to give us a really wide angle. So we'll have to really move our camera back because we don't want to have this really close because it's going to really give us some perspective distortion. Now, one of the other reasons why I picked this backplate in HDRI is because it has nice square buildings. Take a look at this backplate here, and you have this door, right? I don't know. I have no scale of reference aside from what's in these images. So given that, what I want to do is hold Shift right click, and I want to create a cube. So, if you're lucky, you might be able to know the dimensions. Like if you shot this yourself, then obviously you know the dimensions and you've gone through and you have everything marked and measured, and you can easily, not only using software, but easily match them using the simple scale of reference. In our case, because we didn't shoot these ourselves or have a scale of reference, instead I have to find something like this door, and I'm going to assume that this door is somewhere between 8 and 9 feet. Okay. Now I know that 8 feet is a height of 243, 0.84. It doesn't matter too much. Exact dimensions, something like this. So it's 243 centimeters. So 8 feet. So I'm assuming that this door is 8 feet, and this is from 8 feet to 243 centimeters. And then I want the width. The standard width of a door is 36 inches or 3 feet or 91 centimeters. So I can type in now, 91.44 centimeters, and there you go. You get the standard dimension of a door, height and width. Now, with this in mind, and I have this door here, I can set and position this based off of this angle. So it's going to be a combination of moving this back kind of in this position here. And if you start to get depth issues, just increase the depth again of your backplate, and then you can increase. Frankly, I can hide this HDRI so it's not in the way. Okay, so there. So now we have this, and it's going to be a combination of moving this back in the Z to kind of get this pretty close here, where this door is the full size here. And what I'll do is I'll just quickly undock Arnold so you can really see this at full length or at full size here. So I'll make sure that I don't have any, horizontal rotations or anything like that. So I'm going to just ever so slightly kind of move this and just continue to move this back until this door gets in position. And that's why I had to start off by moving it first. And this will give me, again, just something that gets me pretty close to matching the angle and perspective of this. Once I have this, right? Once I have this, then I can now position my vehicle. Now, one thing that you want to do is if you enable resolution gate, I should have did this at the beginning, but it's fine. I can select this resolution gate, and I want to set the resolution to the resolution of this image so I get the full 1:1 aspect ratio. So if I go to common and I do custom here, I'm going to, set this to custom, disable maintain height and width aspect ratio, and then I want to just find the resolution of that image, which is 4,928 by 3264. I'm just going to initially type this in because I want the aspect ratio, 4,928 by 3,000. 264. Then I can do now lock the aspect ratio, and now I can set it to something a lot more manageable like 1200. And there you go. It now will render this out at 1200, and the aspect ratio is locked in. So we're good there. We have our door roughly in position. I'm not going to make sure it's perfect one-to-one, but this is good enough. We have our ground plane, and you can actually see our ground plane looks like it's lining up really well with what we have. Then once I have that, I will then select this view here. I will then select my car and kind of bring this closer now. So I can actually position this in this nice hero position here where it's kind of sitting on this environment. I'm just going to hide this ground plane just so I can make sure that it's not too far away or near that dirt pile, right? So I'm going to just bring this in and rotate it off to the side, kind of push it away just a bit so we get something like this. You want to create something that looks visually interesting. You can do kind of either a straight shot or maybe this front 3/4 here with the tires rotated. So I'll quickly do that. Okay, so now I have it in position. I have the wheels slightly rotated and it looks visually interesting. I can bring this a little bit closer to the camera, but I think you get the idea of how everything is starting to come together. Okay. Now that I have this, I can just get rid of this backplate. The only thing this backplate is being used for in Maya is just to align my camera. So I can simply select this and just delete it. All right. And then my door, I'm going to leave this in here. I'll just hide this for now, just for my reference. And I'm going to bring back my ground plane. So this would be, my shadow plane, plane shadow. All right, now that I have this, let's take a look and see what this looks like once I render it. So we have this here, and I'm going to dock this back. There we go. Going to get everything back in position. So we get something now like this. And I need to make sure that I bring back my dome light. And there we go. So we're getting this now with this vehicle that looks like it was actually in this environment. Now, keep in mind, this is the HDRI here, but it was shot in a pretty close position. And when using image-based lighting, if I actually switch to my perspective camera now and turn off my resolution gate because I won't need that here, and look at this, I can rotate this my dome light now where it actually lines up with what's in the background. All right, so if I just zero this out where I get the original position, and then I start to work from there, because again, if we look at our back plate has this greenhouse to the rear of the vehicle, and that's what I'm trying to find here. So you always have to make sure that your reflections match, right? Because the last thing I'd want is like this salt pile here or this gravel pile here to show up where it shouldn't, right? So I keep rotating and rotating until there we go. There's the greenhouse and then that red house right here off to the side. So now I know that this is pretty close to almost 1-to-1 on what I have in that back plate. So now that everything's aligned and matched up, I can start the process of exporting this out as layers. So I will stop the render here and I'm going to start setting up some layers. And what I want to do as well is find that white material and I'll apply that to the vehicle. So let's see what we got. Yeah, so we get this, which is looking pretty good. So now let's set up render layers, because this is only going to work with the renders set up in Maya or whatever software that you're using for that matter. So I'll just kind of move my cameras here a little bit. And I'll drop these in my backdrops folder. So clean that up. All right, so now that we have everything set up, it is now time to break it all up into layers so we can do our compositing. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is select your dome light and set visibility for camera to 0. If I do a quick render, you'll see that the lighting on the vehicle is still there, but the HDR in panel is no longer in the render. And this is exactly what we want. The next thing we need to do is head over to render setup. And if you want to create a new one or open a new one, just hit this icon at the top and begin creating a new layer. So hit the plus icon to create a new layer. And then I will call this car layer, because this will have the car only. If I right click this, I can create collection, and I'll just call this car geo. And then within this layer here, the car geo layer, I want to select the DatSun resto mod that I have fully materialized and the plane shadow. So middle mouse drag both of those over into this collection, and we have this setup. I now want to create a new layer called shadow layer. So I'll hit the icon again and just call it shadow layer. In this shadow layer, I'll create a new collection, and I'll just call it, shadow collection. And in this collection now, I'm not going to use the same vehicle here. Instead, what I mean is I'm going to duplicate this, isolate real quick, select all of the geometry, shift right click and combine. And I'll combine all of this into one object and let that run for a second. Great. Once that's done, I can delete history. And this DatSun here is only being used as my shadow caster. So shadow caster, probably just shorten this a bit. And this DatSun shadow caster is going to middle mouse drag along with the shadow plane. So select the shadow plane, the shadow caster, and middle mouse drag that into this shadow layer. I can delete this group here as it no longer is needed and the history is deleted. All right, so I have car layer and then shadow layer. Now that I have these two layers, I need to set what's called overrides for these layers. So if I select the car, so I'm just trying to make some room here. So if I select the car here, and you'll see in the attribute editor, so hit Control A for attribute editor, then go to the shape tab, and then you'll see Arnold here. And in this layer here, or in this tab, I want to go down to Arnold visibility, and for the shadow layer, shadow collection, this frankly can always be primary visibility off. Just don't forget that you've left this on in other layers. It'll be in your master layer if you're not careful. So I will just set this to primary visibility off, or you can right click. If I select the top shadow layer here, I can right click this. And to make sure that you hit the eyeball icon so you're actively in this shadow layer, then right click primary visibility and create an absolute override for visible layer. So this is our visible layer, and you can confirm that the shadow layer here, make sure that you don't have this collection set up, otherwise it doesn't do it properly. You have to make sure that you have the topmost layer set, and then you can create an override layer. And what we're going to do now is take this vehicle, disable primary visibility so it's still casting shadows, but it won't be visible in renders. Now, if I head back to the car layer here, and I can exit isolate mode, you'll see that the shadow caster is not in here because that's only in this collection within shadow layer. So we're good there. So within the car layer, you can see that I have the resto mod and then the plane, the shadow plane. What I want to do for this shadow plane, because if I do a quick render here, and let's see what this looks like. And it's thinking real quick, and it renders, and it's just the vehicle on this black background. That's ideally what we want, because the shadow plane here actually is just using scene background. If our scene background is black, that's what it's going to use. It won't capture the shadow properly, okay? I will admit this is a pretty hacky way to get this to work, but it's the only way I found to separate an object from its shadow in order to composite later. So if you have any ideas or maybe more seamless workflows, let me know. But this will work fine for what I'm trying to do. Now you need to be careful, because if you change this when we render just the car geo, because we're actually going to be swapping back and forth here to background color. Watch if I switch to background color, it starts to capture the shadow on this white background, which is what we want for the shadow layer, but not what we want for the car layer. So in this instance, we want this to be seen background here. All right. Now, technically, you could create this as an absolute override. So I'm going to select car layer here, select this background layer, and then create an absolute override. And this will stay as this background here. Then if I head now to my background layer, watch what's going to happen. And I showed you this in the car layer first, so it gives you some context. It shows up black, this annoyed me at the beginning, trying to figure out a solution for this, because it's capturing this over a black background, but it's not capturing any of the lighting. In order to capture the lighting, if you set this background to create absolute override for visible layer here, and then you set this to background color, or you can do it in this here, in this layer here, absolute override, background color, watch what it does. Now it creates this shadow pass here, and it's gathering the lighting information without the HDR in the background. This took me a bit of troubleshooting to figure out, I would call, a working solution. It's not ideal, but hey, it works. All right. So this final layer, if I create a new layer, I'm just going to call this AO layer. And in this layer, I'll create a collection, and I'm just going to call this, I'll just call it AO collection. And in this collection, I want to have the plain shadow and my original resto mod. Add those to that collection and right click this collection here and do a material override. So create material override. And within this material override, I'm going to hit this options box here, and I'm going to simply type in ambient. So if you just type in AMB, it should pop up AI ambient occlusion. It's really nice. Arnold has a ready to go ambient occlusion shader, and this should work for what I'm trying to achieve here. So I would load this AO layer, and then I can hit render this GPU or this IPR, and it should apply an AO pass to everything in this layer. Just give it one more second to think. So Maya crashed, which was very convenient as I was trying to finish up this tutorial, but no worries, I have a save right before this. So make sure to save often. So I have AO layer all set up here, and if I do a quick render and set it to the right camera, we can see that it renders properly with my AO. So all in all, everything should work properly. So what I would do at this point is render each one of these separately. So if I have this AO, I would typically save a snapshot of this, so it's saved at least in this snapshot. Do a save image and find wherever this is, my folder here. And I think I had it right in my comp shadow, demo shadow. And I can call this, AO pass here. So this will be my AO pass, saving as a PNG to save with transparency. You can use whichever format has transparency like PNG, Targas, or if you want to go 32-bit EXRs and TIFFs will work fine. And now if I jump to my shadow layer and render that out, and this is rendering out as well. Keep in mind, I am using denoiser, tone mapper, and lens effects here. So I can cover that in a future tutorial, but at minimum for these shadows and AOs, I'd want to use denoiser. So I can let that run, save this image as well. And I do want to make sure actually I capture that. And if I look at the AO, I want to make sure I don't have any tone mapper, lens effects, or anything on those. Typically, best practice for that. So no big deal. I can save that in my demo folder. And then when I'm finally ready, I can head back to my beauty layer and render that pass out. The one thing to keep in mind as well is that render setup also works with batch renders. So for example, if you wanted to apply this workflow, this layer setup to an animation, you can. And it will apply each of these overrides and layers in order to get it to work. But that's the nice thing about render setup. It's very custom and will work for whatever your needs are. And there we go. So I'll let this render out for another minute or so. Great. And save this out. And now I can put this all together. So if I head back to Photoshop and open this up, what I want to do first is actually bring in my original images. So because this is the correct resolution, the other one is a large resolution. The backplate is a large resolution, so I'll call this beauty pass. And with this beauty pass in here, I can also bring in my AO and my shadow. Bring those in. I'll reorder them here shortly. And then I can finally bring in my, if I go to material workflow, source images, my backplate. And you can either bring in the raw if you want to color correct or tone map that yourself, but I'm going to just bring in the pretty one, the JPEG, let that think. And this backplate is going to sit on the bottom. The beauty pass will sit in the middle, the AO pass on top, and the shadow pass on the bottom. And the way to get this all to work is now I'd select AO pass and shadow pass and set those to multiply. Oops, I have the layers or the multipliers a little bit off, but here we are. So we have the AO pass, the beauty pass, and the shadow pass, all as separate elements here. And this is what I found to be the best way to get this all out of Maya using Arnold separately. And the nice thing is, you know, I have this all tone mapped and it's looking pretty good here. There's some more color grading and retouching that I'd want to do and some more material work, but this should cover the overall workflow here. So I hope you found this helpful. So as always, if you found this helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe and share this content. That's the best way to help this channel grow and get this out there for more people. So a big thank you to everybody. You know, I really appreciate the growth, comments, and sharing and everything over the past few months here. So, but yeah, big thank you to everybody. I hope this was helpful. So let me know down below what you'd like me to cover next. Thanks, and I'll see you around.